Again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Lenten journey towards becoming beloved community. I'm Patty Ames, the Canon for Christian Formation and the diocesan staff support person for our mission and ministry in becoming beloved community. I want to welcome you all tonight. Thank you for being here. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping things to be aware of. I ask you to please stay muted during the presentation this evening. That helps to decrease background noise, makes it easier for everyone to hear. We will take questions at the end after our speakers have presented. If you fear you might forget your question, you can put it in the chat box and I will monitor that. We are recording this session this evening, so if you prefer to have your camera off, that's fine. The recording will be available either by tomorrow afternoon or on Thursday. Check our social media and our Dio Suava YouTube channel. It's always available there. The last thing to remind you of, if you weren't here last week, or a reminder that I will send a follow-up email with resources that were shared, information, and other things from tonight's presentation. Tonight, we're focusing on the area of history in regard to becoming beloved community. It's one of the 4 areas of focus the guiding team chose to work on to assist individuals and parishes. Tonight's presenters are the Reverend Nina Salmon, the Reverend Preston Mitchell, and Jennifer Berenson and the Reverend Tuck Bauerfeind. All these wonderful folks are part of our Becoming Beloved Community guiding team, and you are in for quite an evening with their presentations tonight. But before we begin, I invite you to still your hearts and your minds, and I'm going to ask our first presenter, Nina Salmon, to open us in prayer.
Thank you, Patty. Let us pray. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your strength to live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit. For you are God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Nina. I appreciate you opening us in prayer. And again, that prayer comes from, it's the gathering prayer from the Disciples Prayer Book from the Episcopal Church's Indigenous Ministries office. And tonight, Nina is going to open us with a presentation. Nina is a bivocational priest, meaning she has 2 ministries, as I call them. Nina is first the Associate Rector for Youth and Families at St. Paul's in Lynchburg. She is also an Associate Professor of English and the Director of a Senior Symposium at the University of Lynchburg. Nina merged these 2 areas and ministries in her doctoral dissertation, Paved with Good Intentions, The Road to Racial Unity in the Episcopal Diocese of Southwestern Virginia. Nina, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patty. I still get a little triggered talking about my dissertation because it's not that, it hadn't been that long that I was in the middle of that project, that long project. So I defended in April of 2016 and got my final edits in June, the day before I started CPE, and did things backwards, as I have done most of my life. Did CPE before I went to seminary, and headed off to Sewanee for a year. Came back, taught a semester, and did another semester at Sewanee for what some of my friends called a victory lap. Needed more work, so I went back for more school. It's been a really exciting journey. Patty says 2 ministries, 2 vocations, 2 callings, and I also often describe myself as an old professor and a new priest. I've taught at the University of Lynchburg my entire adult life, it seems, since 1997, and have been ordained for about 5 years. So it's been a wonderful journey. And my doctoral dissertation does merge those two in some significant ways. My task tonight is to talk a little bit about the history of our diocese and the four Black churches that existed in our diocese. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history, and then I'm delighted to hand off to my wonderful colleagues on the Becoming Beloved Community Commission, who will then follow up with a robust discussion. And I think that we'll have time for some questions at the end, but I'm just going to go quickly through this history piece, and then we'll move into their piece, and then we can circle back if there's time. And if not, we can always chat later. So much of this is a refresher for many of you. And I expect that there are things that you know that you can share with me later that I don't know. And I would love to hear what you have to share as well. And there are things that I do know that I'm not going to share. So this is a snapshot. So we'll start here. And I think it's interesting to note that the trajectory of the birth and growth of the Episcopal Church parallels the creation and institutionalization of racism. That is a truth that we can observe and we can note through history. Those two things are intertwined. James Madison, the second cousin of our fourth president of the United States, was the first bishop of Virginia, and he was consecrated in 1790. So that says 1795. So that's right. It does say 1790. The Diocese of Virginia existed a few years before the first bishop came about. And of course, the Episcopal Church in the United States emerged soon after the Declaration of Independence. The Diocese of Virginia split into two dioceses in 1892. The new creation was the Diocese of Southern Virginia. And the Diocese of Southwestern Virginia, our diocese, emerged in 1919, splitting off from the Diocese of Southern Virginia. Geographically, the Diocese of Virginia represents the northern part of the state, claiming the Central Corridor and going down into Richmond to the natural border of the James River. Southern Virginia includes the Eastern Shore and all points south of the James. As far west as Danville. And Southwestern Virginia is, of course, the western tip of the state, with Bath County and Nelson County at the northern edges. Our three bishops in the era that we're focusing on are the first bishop of this diocese, Robert Carter Jett, who was elected bishop in the emerging diocese in 1920, and he served until 1938. Bishop Henry Disbrow Phillips, 1882 to 1955. Those were his birth years, and he served until 1954, which of course was a key year in our nation's history and in the history of race in America. And then Bishop William Henry Marmion, who served as the bishop of this diocese from 1954 until 1979. Bishop Marmion took office right in the same week as the decisions were being handed down, Brown versus the Board of Education. Depending on who you ask, one of those three men looks like God. My mother says that Bishop Phillips is her image of God. When she pictures what God looks like, it's Bishop Phillips. When I was a little girl, Bishop Marmion was the very image of God to me. So these bishops are in the imaginations of many of the people in this diocese. And all three were good men that many of you knew and loved. So the four churches that were in our diocese that were churches for people of color emerged at different points and had different lifespans. And I want to speak a little bit about those. But before I get to that, I want to sort of root our understanding of what was happening in these days. When Bishop Phillips was consecrated in 1938, our neighboring a neighboring diocese of North Carolina, the bishop was a name that some of you will recognize, Bishop Edwin A. Penick of North Carolina, preached at the consecration. And at the consecration of Bishop Phillips, Bishop Penick called for an emphasis on the evangelism of the Negro and the leadership of the church in an industrialized South. So at this time, there were 3 Black congregations. Those first 3, St. Philip's in Bedford, Chapel of the Good Shepherd in Lynchburg, and St. Luke's in Roanoke. And the 4th was on the brink of existence. On the day of this consecration, the church at St. Paul's had not yet begun, but the talks were there. The congregation had begun hoping to organize a mission, and St. Paul's is unique in that it was organized by the members of the Black members of Martinsville. It was not organized as a mission. It was organized separately by people of color who lived in Martinsville who wanted to form a church. So that marks it as something that's a little bit different, a little bit unusual for its time. Patty, can we go to the next slide, please? The 4 Black churches had healthy lives from their beginning. And what you'll see as we flip through, and don't flip through yet, but what we'll see is that these churches were served by clergymen throughout their time. But the clergymen who originally served the churches were Black clergymen. And towards the end of the time, you'll see, for instance, in this case, that beginning in 1956, William Beale of St. John's Bedford was serving St. Philip's, and then George Barton of St. John's Bedford was serving St. Philip's. And then there was a time of vacancy before John Sibley of St. John's Bedford was serving the congregation. So in some of the other churches, it was white clergymen who were serving the African-American churches. Finding Black clergymen was a challenge, and that was a difficulty. So what happened in about 1966 was that many of the churches began to dwindle in congregation size, and that coincided with a time of what Bishop Marmion described as harmonious relations. At a diocesan convention, then called diocesan council, Bishop Marmion identified 3 areas of focus. And the first of the 3 areas that he addressed was interracial understanding. The other 2 were Christian education and stewardship. And Marmion discussed the idea of harmonious relations and noted that because there were harmonious relations, it was time to integrate these churches. The law provided for integration, and in order to restore harmonious relations, Bishop Marmion turned his gaze to integrating the diocese, and he began to systematically close smaller churches, inviting them to blend with the existing white congregations that were nearby. It needs to be noted that the Black churches were not the only small churches to close. There were other small parishes that were facing similar challenges at the time with finances or membership and leadership. Clergy leadership was a shortage of clergy was a real problem. So St. John's Ferrum closed in 1965. Emmanuel Madison Heights. These were churches that were white churches, closed in January of 1967. Emmanuel Eagle Rock, St. Stephen's Nora, St. Paul Grace House, all closed in December of 1967. So the 1968 Southwestern Episcopalian included this comment that these churches, Emmanuel, Grace House on the Mountain, St. Stephen's, Nora, ceased regular services on December 31st. In the latter two cases, it is hoped that the buildings will be used as community centers. The numbers that had dwindled required the closing of these churches. The diocesan newsletter also stated in that same year that the changing social climate was a positive reason for change in the diocese, and it allowed for the closing of the Black churches, of three of the Black churches anyway, of St. Luke's and Chapel of the Good Shepherd, and St. Philip's was also. St. Paul's remained open until just a year or two ago. Bishop Marmion this is where the title of the dissertation comes from, is Paved with Good Intentions. Bishop Marmion led a movement that was progressive in the one sense because it was in the interest of integration. It was in the interest of promoting racial unity that those Black churches were closed. It was a positive intent, but as we know, it was detrimental because the closing of the Black churches eliminated a power base for African Americans in their communities. Many of the Black members could and would choose to become part of the extant white Episcopal churches in their communities, but the power balance was such that the population of Black Episcopalians waned. So the integration story is very much still a story of what happened in the white community. We have less information about what happened in the Black community. Less is written about it. Less is recorded in our diocesan records. Part of my work did involve oral histories with 9 members of the previously healthy Black churches who are either now part of our existing parishes or members of the community that I was able to contact through the help of some of you on the screen. I was able to baptize the great-granddaughter of one of the people I interviewed about 2 years ago. So that was a happy moment. The great-grandmother is a member of St. Paul's who came to St. Paul's when Chapel of the Good Shepherd was closed. I think the well-intentioned decision to close the Black churches is not something that could have been recognized at the time. Bishop Heath Light has said, and others have said that it's a twist on that line from T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, that Bishop Marmion did the wrong deed for the right reason. He was well-intentioned. He was careful and deliberate in all of his study and reflection. He was a proponent of the dignity of every human being and hoped for harmonious relations, and the good of all of the churches and all of the congregations. But what we have seen, what we saw was a loss of the power base in the Black community and a dwindling of the Black congregants in our own churches. I don't want to take up any more time on this, but yeah, Patty, if you'll flip through and just take a look at some of these, and just to highlight, you'll see the name Charles Summers in all of these slides. Charles Summers in the, it's not in that slide, but in the previous slides, he was the one of the main Black priests that we had in this diocese, and he served the 3 churches concurrently. And then after that, we dwindle into mostly white priests who were serving the Black congregations.
Patty, you're muted.
Was trying to be good while Nina was talking. Thank you, Nina, for that important but brief history to learn more about our diocese and the background. It's so important that we know that information and that history because it is a part of who we are. And now we are going to take a look forward as we talk with the Reverend Preston Mitchell. Preston is a retired professor of history at the University of Virginia at Wise and a deacon in our diocese. He has a passion both for history and becoming beloved community, working for racial justice, reconciliation, and healing. He works tirelessly in Wise County and in the Appalachian area to make history known in a variety of ways that you will hear in just a moment. I had the privilege of being part of the Black in Appalachia pilgrimage and learned so much history that happened right here in our diocese that many of us would not know if it weren't for the efforts of Preston. So Preston, thank you so much. And I'm going to screen share to yours in just a moment, but you can take it away. Hang on one second.
There, I'm unmuted. So, yeah, I'm happy to talk about history. And one of the things that in facilitating sacred ground, when people kept saying, "Oh, I didn't learn that in history," and I kind of cringe a little bit teaching U.S. history survey. There's only so much you can teach, and so probably a lot of what I'm going to talk about you've never heard about before, and like so much. Before we go forward, she said I was going to be going forward. I was going to go backwards to talk about some history. I will say also to segue a bit, I was fortunate to officiate and preach at St. Paul's Martinsville before they closed in preparation for our pilgrimage in 2019. And up top, I want to say too about Black in Appalachia. That is coined a podcast that William Isom out of Hamlin County, Tennessee, created and works as a full-time filmographer and researcher and historical person of interest. And you can go to Black in Appalachia and view all kinds of video and all kinds of great work that he does. And you'll watch a couple of these short videos that I'm going to show that he worked with us in Wise County. But the first thing I would like to say is that there's a misperception and really historical silence about Blacks in Appalachia, in the mountains. The perception is that, well, there never was much slavery in the mountains and everybody kind of got along, and we don't really need to put ourselves in the same vein as the rest of the South. And that's simply not true. Wilma Dunaway is a retired professor of sociology at Virginia Tech who has authored a couple of really good data-driven books on slavery in the American Mountain South is one of her books, and the other one is The African American Family in Slavery and Emancipation. Relatively new books in the last 20 years that she has had published. And the fact is that 17% of people in the Mountain South were enslaved, and 18% owned these enslaved people. I focus most of my work in the far Southwest in Lee County, Virginia, 4,500 folks, excuse me, that's Wise County, 4,500 folks. There were only 66 enslaved people, but next door in Lee County, out of 10,267, 744 enslaved people and only 11 free people. If we drop down to Washington County, 16% of people were enslaved. Smith County, 13%. Tazewell County, 13%. Moving up the interstate, Wythe County, 18%. Roanoke, 34%. Rockbridge County, 25%. Campbell, 48%. 42% in Bedford County, 48% in Amherst County. These are all census figures from 1860. Even if you go further west in the mountains, Craig County, Bath County, and Giles County all had over 10% of their people were enslaved. And that's pretty significant. One other kind of anomaly of some sort is McDowell County, which is now West Virginia, which was, of course, Virginia before the Civil War, had 0 Black residents or enslaved people. And later, in the coal boom of the early 1900s, McDowell County had over 50% Black residents due to the coal industry. A real interesting book on Jews in the coal field and the coalition in McDowell County of Jews and Blacks that dominated politics in Keystone, West Virginia. But this is a picture. The slide that I have there is a picture of Bluff Spur of Black Mountain, where there existed a freedmen's colony. After the Civil War, Dan and Mary Richmond led a colony of about 25 people from Lee County to the top. You'd see right there is actually, that whole ridge there was populated by this group in 1871, stayed there till 1899 when they sold their land to a coal company. You can go to the next slide, Patty. That's Dr. William Turner at the Danfields, is the name of the land at the cemetery that's on top of the mountain. And Dr. William Turner is the author of The Harlan Renaissance, which is a book that he wrote about growing up in Lynch, Kentucky, on the other side of Black Mountain in Harlan County. Won the Weatherford Award for the best nonfiction work of Appalachia in 2023. But that's part of what my study has been working on this, and the chapter is going to be has been approved for publication in Blacks in Appalachia Volume 2, which is edited by Dr. Turner. You can go to the next slide there. This is a picture of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And what you can see from the distance there are some replicas of steel coffins suspended from the ceiling, and with the names, each one of those coffins are counties in the South that had documented lynchings. The next slide. In Wise County, there are 3 lynching victims: Wiley Ginn, 1902, David Hurst, 1920, and Leonard Woods in 1927. And it was really the beginning of working on this was a trip that Melissa Hayes Smith and Ann Grizzle and I went 6 or 7 years ago, the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Justice in Atlanta, and learned about the beginnings of this. And so went home and eventually formed a community remembrance group, and we have markers for all three of those lynching victims. There were, at the time, the Equal Justice Initiative said there were 4,400 documented lynching victims. That's been updated now going back to 1865, and the numbers, I think 6,200 now documented lynchings. There are less than 100 markers in the South. There's one in Richmond for Robert Smith. I attended that dedication. And then we have 3 in Wise County, but there's less than 100 of those. I'm working with Tina McDaniel in Bristol for the lynching of Robert Clark, and she's made great strides with that. We hope to have that marker this summer in Bristol, Virginia. The next slide. Out of the 3, this one I just picked because we had the sign stolen, but we got it replaced just 2 weeks ago. But he was accused of assault and arrested, and a mob broke into the Wise County Jail, took him back, and hanged him and dragged him to the road, and left. Next slide. The next slide.
On behalf of the Community Remembrance Project, I welcome you all, and I want to say a few things about that. The Community Remembrance Project began 4 years ago, and it was originally a coalition consisting of African American churches in Wise County, the Episcopal churches in Wise County, UVA Wise, the Pound Historical Society, and the Wise County School Board.
On November the 14th, 1920, a large white mob lynched a 25-year-old black coal miner by the name of Dave Hurst. Authorities had arrested Mr. Hurst 2 days earlier after a white woman reported that she had been assaulted by a black man. During this era, the deep racial hostility that permeated Southern society burdened black people with the presumption of guilt that often served to focus suspicion on black communities after a crime was reported or discovered, whether evidence supported that suspicion or not. In the early morning hours of November the 14th, a white mob broke into the Wise County, Virginia jail, kidnapped Mr. Hurst, and drove him to a bridge about 2 miles near here, where they hanged him with a log chain. Afterwards, the mob shot the body repeatedly and then dragged Mr. Hurst's remains by car to Blackwood. His clothes were torn off and his body was bruised and disfigured by the bullets. Although 2 white men were tried and convicted for participating in the mob, the governor of Virginia pardoned the men in 1923. None of the other dozens to hundreds of mob participants faced any legal repercussions for their roles in the lynching of Dave Hurst.
This is where the sign once stood near Appalachia, Virginia. The coalition behind the sign says its theft is shocking, but it won't stop them from building a new one.
How can we keep living in the future if we don't know anything about the past?
Gravely and other members of the coalition are committed to get it replaced should the original never turn up.
Yeah. On behalf
Yeah, maybe go to the next. The next is just a minute long. It's the soil collection, and this is the site that David Hurst was lynched. And part of the project is to recover the soil and then send it to Montgomery for display there. And this is a very short video, but pretty powerful, I think. Go ahead.
At the site of where someone died, there's power in that soil. So I think recognizing it, remembering it, if it doesn't heal outwardly, it heals the land in that way.
yes, it hurts because they don't know. They don't know. They don't know.
A piece of my home soil is connected to just that, the hundreds of thousands of other people and collections of soil that are down there, but also the millions of souls that are lost to the brutality of and violence of white supremacy that's been prevalent in our nation since its origin.
I think there's maybe one more slide.
That was all that you had marked.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
That's right. No, that's all right. I've used my 15 minutes. Anyhow, like I say, there's a whole lot to talk about with Black in Appalachia, but I think the dominant theme is that so much of this has been kind of forgotten, or maybe not even remembered. That Blacks in Appalachia had been seen as kind of an invisible group. So I think that's my 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Preston. I really appreciate you sharing that part of our history in our diocese, that at least I can speak for myself, I was unaware of. And it's so important we hear these stories and remember these names. We're going to shift now to two other members of our guiding team, Jennifer Berenson and Tuck Bauerfeind. We're going to talk a little bit about the work of the subcommittee focusing on history and how you can look at your own history and your parish's history. So Tuck and Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Preston. Thank you, Nina.
Tuck?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm gonna speak a little bit about framing this work in the parish setting. And Jennifer is going to share some resources, an outline of resources that she has put together for studying history of race and racism in our parishes and in our diocese. Is that right, Jennifer? Am I all right? So, I think that we heard a reference to the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta, which is run by the Reverend Dr. Catherine Meeks, and Dr. Meeks is very clear, and I think rightly so, that that all of this work is spiritual work, that it's deeply about the meaning and practice of Eucharist and the presence of Christ, and that some of the framing of this is appropriately done as a framing around the fellowship table, that as long as we are all, white supremacists around the table, as Nina has pointed out, which largely is the history of our church, we're not truly representing the Eucharistic fellowship that Christ calls us into. Now, that being said, I've never found that to be a particularly successful way of framing it for reception in the parish setting. A lot of members of the parish of every parish I've served in, and I think to some extent, just out of a practical perspective, have viewed anti-racism work as irrelevant to their parish life. And it doesn't serve any real purpose to sort of hit them over the head with it, or to make them feel, or to diminish people because that's the way they see things. So and I'm sure all of us encounter people who see anti-racism work as partisan politics, as in service of a particular political agenda, and not something that really has anything to do with their Christian life or practice. So for me personally, a lot of times this work has begun by me doing it, in some sense, on my own, and then trying to find allies in the congregation who share that interest and building out from there. And at the same time, engaging in enough dialogue with people who aren't interested or opposed to this work to assure them that I'm not trying to to do anything overtly political, I suppose, in a partisan sense, and that that I'm open to hearing what their objections are and to living with some restraint or working with some restraint on this. I know that in the diocese, here at Grace, for example, in the first few months of my time here, parishioners asked me if we could put out a Black Lives Matter sign after the George Floyd incident, the murder of George Floyd. And I said, we can, and we'll see what happens. We did, and there was a predictable set of objections from a narrow but very vocal set of members of the parish, and the positive thing about that was it opened up an opportunity for a dialogue that we had, where people, and I think this is something that is almost always useful if you can create enough heat and interest in people to participate, but sometimes it means you have to do something to stir the pot. But we invited people to a dialogue. About 40 people participated, and the rule of the dialogue was you could only speak for yourself. There was no judgment, and the only question was, should we put a Black Lives Matter sign out in front of the church? And if so, why? And if not, why? Why not? And people spoke very openly and honestly about their opinions about that. No one in this parish rejects people because they're Black. They reject things like Black Lives Matter because they see them as overtly democratic or communist or some political leaning. But anyway, you have to in my experience, you got to do something to surface some of these expressions, hear people, and then see if you can identify some common ground that people are willing to work on. At Grace, it turned out people were not willing to put signs out, but they were willing to make a commitment to pursuing racial equity work in the community. And so we focused in that direction. And over the last couple of years, we've invested $125,000 in Black entrepreneurial businesses in Lexington, and in a project to build relationships with the NAACP leaders to recruit and retain teachers of color in Lexington schools. We've also been able to work with Washington and Lee students to do research into our parish archives and tell more accurately the story of enslaved persons in our congregation and the early history of our parish. And we're working on next steps of telling the history of our parish with people of color through the time period that Nina has more focused on. Anyway, enough from me. Jennifer, do you want to share some of the resources you've identified?
Sure. Thanks, Tuck, and thank you, everybody else, for your portions this evening. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay, that's not what you want to see. Okay, you should see a Word document up there right now. Does that look right, everybody? Great.
Yes.
You. So this is a Word document that I've created where I've just been throwing in all kinds of resources, hopefully that would be useful for people in any parish who wanted to start doing research about the history of their parish in terms of its connection to slavery and other forms of white supremacy. And so there's a variety of kinds of information I put in here. I'm just going to quickly scroll through a little bit and point out the kinds of things that are here. The goal ultimately would be to have this in a good enough form that it could be made available to all of you, posted on the Dioswava website, because there's lots and lots of links here. So this first page that you're seeing right now is just intended to give some basic advice to somebody who maybe hasn't done historical research before about how to go about trying to do this. And I think Tuck has given us some really good advice about even things prior to sort of diving into archives and coming up with research questions about how to think about how to engage a parish, or at least more than just yourself within your parish in this work. So there's some information here about ways you'd initially try to go about engaging in this, some questions that you might have. You might be looking for names of individual people, right? Individual people that owned slaves, individual people that were enslaved by others. The extent to which Black Americans might have been engaged in your particular parish's life at any particular point, right? I'm going to scroll down a little bit farther. One of the things we talked about in the our guiding team was the need for a parish timeline, not just for your individual parish, but for all the parishes in the diocese. And depending on how far back you're interested in going, as Nina showed us, the different dioceses that had different geographical extent in previous times. So one of the things I tried to do, and I don't claim that I got my dates all right here because there's competing dates listed in different places, and I haven't learned enough yet to tell which is which. But what I've tried to do is to put together a list in order of their founding of all the parishes in this diocese, right? So, And this is important because, you know, if you're a member of a parish that's relatively new, it was one that split off from another parish. If you're interested in your history, it may mean going back even before the time of the founding of your particular parish, if you want to take it that far back, in which case you need to know where you came from, right? And its legacy going back there. So in some of these parishes, you can see I've got links here because they have some sort of a, albeit usually pretty brief, history of the parish on their webpage. So this is just a resource that may become useful for some people. Talk a little bit here about the importance of oral history. And for those of you who are interested in things of which there are still people alive to talk to interview, there's no time like the present to do that because pretty soon those resources are gone. I included some links here about how to do oral history, some resources like from the Smithsonian. I myself, I work in the ancient world in my job at Roanoke College. So I have not done oral history myself, except insofar as I've interviewed family members about ancestry kinds of things and such. So no professional here, but there's some good resources here for those who would like to, you know, identify some older members of your congregations, your parishes, and have them become, you know, living sources to help you understand what the racial dynamics in your parishes were like some years ago. Parish records themselves, this has been a whole education because there's all sorts of records and they're in all sorts of places. So I tried to do a little bit of summary about the kinds of things you might find that are part of parish records, everything from vestry minutes to books of sermons and diaries and committee minutes and photographs and directories and the whole 9 yards. Knowing where to find one's parish's archives is really important. Not all of them are easily located or immediately located. Not all of those places where those parish records are stored are necessarily really well organized. So I tried to give some links here about how you could access diocesan records and other parish records. You see I've got some links here. And some people, in some cases, some people that one could contact. Some of the archives are searchable. Some of them are in different places. So if anybody wants to engage in this, this is not something that you can just easily and completely do from behind your computer desk. Now, you know, in the course of a couple of hours, last summer, I started looking around on the US Census records to find out about some of the major names in the history of St. John's, Roanoke, where I worship. And pretty quickly, I could find lots of really interesting information about people, major leaders in the church, and how many people that they had enslaved under their authority and such. So you can get lots of interesting information, but to fully do these projects justice, I think people are going to have to like go places and actually dig through archives, which can be fun if you're a really geeky person like myself. There are some other information here. I think since we only have like 5 minutes left, this would probably be a good place for me to just say that my intent is to make this available for those who would want to dive in and see if it gives them, you know, at least a few directions about how to start a project. So I'll stop with that, and maybe if we have time for questions or whatever, we can go with that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Tucker. Appreciate those insights and reminding us there are lots of different on-ramps here and avenues for people to pursue as they take a look at history. I want to open it up if you would like to unmute if you have a question for Nina, Preston, Tuck, Jennifer. please feel free to unmute and ask your question. If you would prefer to put it in the chat box, that's okay too. But we're happy to open it up to any questions for the next couple of minutes.
I have a question for Tuck.
Sure,
Tuck, I'm curious if did you put up the Black Lives Matter sign at the church and then have backlash and take it down, or was the backlash just at the idea?
No, we put it up. Yeah, that created the I guess what I think of as the heat. The you know, as with a lot of these things, one of the major things you find out is that most people just don't want conflict. Um, very, very few people are actually opposed to any particular action on the face of it, but because some people are opposed, and most people just are opposed to anything that produces disruption. But I'm not sure you make progress without some disruption. So
Thanks, Tuck. There's a question in the chat. Were there graveyards at any of the Black parishes? And
it's a
I
great
guess it
question.
means to do some research. Nina, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I was just typing back to say that's a great question, Nancy, and I don't know. But I will see what I can find out. And there are people on this screen that I didn't see on the screen when I was talking. And if I had, I would have just closed my mouth and just said, Susan Mead, you were there. You were at Hemlock Haven. And I did. Hemlock Haven is one of the things that I said I couldn't talk about everything. And I didn't even talk about Hemlock Haven, which was a huge, that was sort of the jumping off point of my whole thing. Bob Copenhaver. I mean, you all can tell some stories for sure. But graveyards, that's a great question.
There's always many more stories to tell, and these are important stories to tell. Tonight was just a insights into some of these areas, and so there's more to learn, and that would be one thing about those graveyards. So we will work on that. Any other questions? It looks like Marilyn. Yes, you can unmute yourself if you like.
Say hello to everybody. I really enjoyed the presentation. I met Preston in Big Stone Gap at the Christ Church. I haven't met the other presenters tonight, but I am really interested in learning more. I am African American. My ancestors come from Lynchburg, Virginia, and really of pretty high status in education. And my grandfather was a doctor there. So there's a pretty long trail, but I haven't yet tapped into a lot of that information. And Jennifer, I really would like to get with you. Tuck, I would really like to get with you. And it's just opened me up to what's available and already available. So I thank you for the presentation, and I look forward to having a chat or coffee or anything to just start to get involved in some way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's the purpose of the guiding team and myself on diocesan staff. We are here to have those conversations and to keep the conversations going. And so I'm so glad that you were here this evening and want to keep those conversations going and all of us learning more. It's an important journey and going back to our baptismal covenant, how we live that out. So I'm so grateful for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think as our time is coming to 8 o'clock, we will close in prayer, as we did last week, and using the prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, a prayer for social justice. Let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Again, I want to thank our speakers this evening, Nina, Preston, Tuck, and Jennifer. Next week, I hope you all will join us as we share a variety of resources, information, sites. You heard about the Absalom Jones Center. We'll talk about a lot of those different things with more guiding team members. And again, this recording will be available either by tomorrow afternoon or Thursday on our social media and YouTube channel. And we hope that you will join us next week. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. God bless and good night.